Hey everybody, John Wertsema here. A big shout out to all my subscribers out there. Thank you so much for subscribing to this channel and watching my videos. Today we're going to be discussing a big topic in the book of Revelation, and it is the male child. Who is the male child of Revelation 12:5? Now, if you've never gone through this study before, I think you're going to find this very, very interesting, very fascinating. Now, there's two ways to approach this study. Number one is to just take surface observations and try and make your interpretation out of that, or you can go deep into the meaning behind the different things that we see along the lines of the male child and get the true meaning. Surface observations are fine, but you're never going to get the identity correct if that's all you do. So there are four identifying factors on the surface about the male child of Revelation 12:5. And here we have in verse 5, it says, "She gave birth to a son, a male child, who is to rule all the nations with the rod of iron, and her child was caught up to God and to his throne." So we have four observations. Number one, the man-child is a male person. Number two, the man-child is born. I mean, these are obvious, right? These are obvious observations. Number three, the man-child is to rule with a rod of iron. And number four, the man-child is caught up to God and to his throne. That's it. Four main observations in this verse. Now, a lot of people try to make their interpretation of who the male child is based on just these four observations. Well, he's a man, he's a male, he's born, he rules with a rod of iron, and he's caught up to God and to his throne. And the first person that comes to mind when they see these four observations, anybody can see, is, oh, this is talking about Jesus. Because Jesus is a male, he was born into the world, he's going to rule with a rod of iron, and he was caught up to God and to his throne, at the resurrection. So, these observations, a lot of times people come to that conclusion. Well, Jesus is the male child. However, that's actually not correct. I should say it's not fully correct. Jesus has a part to play in this for sure. Jesus is all of these things. He is a male. He was born of the virgin. He will rule with the rod of iron, and he was caught up. But you have to ask the question, is he the only one that fits these four observations? And the answer is no. He's not the only one. First of all, you're going to need to dig a lot deeper than surface observations in order to come to the correct identity of the male child. Okay? That's been the problem all along. People just say, oh, this is obvious, it's so clear. Well, there's three things that you are going to need to do in order to understand who the male child is. The first thing you're going to need to be able to do is you must remember that figurative language is being used, and you must resist the urge to always see things in a literal sense. Number two, you must observe, acknowledge, and accept that all of the events of Revelation 12 are future and happen in the middle of Daniel's 70th week, or that last 7 years. And number three, you must consider and fully embrace the spiritual realities of our union with Christ. Now, if you do those three things, you will come to the understanding of who the male child is, the correct understanding. And that's what we're going to do. Now, this video is the first of maybe 2 or 3 videos. I haven't decided yet how many this is going to be. because there's just no way to cover all this information in a short, 15 to 25 minute video. It's too much information to get into in that short of period of time. So we're going to tackle this subject, and if you stay with me until the end, even if it's 2 or 3 videos, if you watch until the end of this study, you will have an understanding of who the male child is, who the male child represents. And not only that, it is going to be such a huge blessing to you to know the truth of this, and it'll be a relief because, a lot of people ask me the question about the book of Revelation. I get this question a lot. If God wanted us to understand this stuff, why did he make it so difficult? Why is it so, enshrouded in all this mystery and figurative language? And really, there's probably 2 correct answers to that question. Number 1 is, I believe that we weren't supposed to, or nobody is supposed to fully understand the meaning of all these things until the time of the end. It says over in Daniel Daniel was told to seal up these things until the end. And so there is a reality of, as we get closer and closer to the Lord's coming, that these things will start to be understood more and more. So that's number 1. Number 2 is why is the book of Revelation so difficult to understand? The second answer is because he wants us to dig deep. He doesn't want us to just passively look at this information and say, oh yeah, I know the answer to that, and toss it away as if it doesn't mean anything. So he wants us to dig deep. He wants us to search. And this is one of those things, in order to understand who the male child is, you're going to have to spread your wings, and you're going to have a good grasp of a lot of topics and a lot of things that are going on in the entire Bible. This is a deep subject. It's not shallow. Okay, so that's why I said earlier, just looking at these shallow observations, they're not going to get you anywhere when it comes to this subject. So let's begin by studying the first phase of how do we determine who this male child is. Okay, I mentioned to you just a few minutes ago that there are 3 things that you're going to need to do before you can understand who the male child is. And the first one that we're going to talk about is that you have to understand that figurative language is being used. Okay, so when it comes to the surface observations, he's a male, he's born, he rules with a rod of iron, and he's caught up to God and to his throne. Okay, if you take those 4 things literal, which is what most people do, then the obvious conclusion is it's talking about Jesus, because Jesus literally did all those things. But, sorry to have to tell you this, but all 4 of these things are figurative. The man-child being male is figurative. The man-child being born is figurative. It's not talking about a literal birth. The man-child ruling with a rod of iron, that's also figurative language. Number 4, the man-child being caught up to God and to his throne is also figurative language. Now, that one is partially literal and partially figurative. Caught up to God, yeah, that's literal. But to his throne, that's a figurative way of talking about ruling or the having authority. Okay, so all 4 of these things are figurative in one way or another. So, when we look through the entire chapter of Revelation chapter 12, okay, you have to come to an understanding of how to determine when something is literal and when something is figurative. Okay, so just looking here in verse 1, it says, a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. Well, there's a lot of figurative language being used here. Okay, and she was with child, figuratively. She cried out, being in labor and pain to give birth, figurative. Okay, another sign appeared in heaven. Now, heaven here would be literal. It's actually happening in heaven, right? And behold, a great red dragon having 7 heads, 10 horns, and on his heads were 7 diadems or 7 crowns. Okay, the great red dragon, that's figurative language. It's figurative. There wasn't a literal dragon. Okay, so you have to be able to determine what's figurative, what's literal. Now, when we go down here to starting in verse 7, and it says, and there was a war in heaven. Now, this isn't a figurative war. This is a literal war. This is a war that actually takes place. Michael and his angels are literally Michael and his angels. Michael and his angels, that's not figurative, okay? That's literal. Michael and his angels waged war with the dragon. The dragon is still figurative, okay? The dragon and his angels waged war. Okay, the dragon is figurative, but his angels are literal, right? Okay, and then it says, they were not strong enough, and there was no longer found any place for them in heaven. Heaven is literal. Now, the Bible starts to unravel some of the figurative language. The great red dragon was thrown down, the serpent of old. So the great red dragon is being identified as the serpent of old, the serpent that was in the garden, who is called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. Okay, so the dragon is figurative language. Okay, but the figurative language represents somebody literally. And that dragon represents Satan himself, the serpent of old, the serpent from the garden. Now, him deceiving the whole world, yeah, that's literal, that's not figurative. He was thrown down to the earth and his angels were thrown down with him, that's literal. There's nothing figurative about that. Because Michael and his angels waged this war, all of that war is literal and it will literally happen. Okay? Then, in verse 10, I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have come. That's all literal. Okay, that's all going to literally happen. Okay, so when you go through this, I just wanted to do that as an exercise, just to show you that you gotta think in these terms. Okay, what's figurative, what's literal, and you gotta. I don't know the best way to give you an answer of, well, how do you determine what's figurative and what's literal, other than you just from experience, from reading the book of Revelation, from reading the Old Testament prophets, you just begin to develop a sense, a discernment over what's figurative and what's literal. But that has to be put into practice. You need to actually take the time to think about, is this figurative or is this literal? And start separating those things in your mind, because it just brings clarity. It brings clarity. So when we go over here to verse 5, and it says, and she gave birth to a male child. Okay, the birth, you have to ask, is this figurative or is this literal? The male child, is this speaking figuratively or is this speaking literal? Okay, this is just an exercise that we have to do, not just here in chapter 12, but throughout the whole book of Revelation. You have to exercise this process of determining what's literal and what's figurative. There's a lot of times in periods of time in the book of Revelation, 1,000 years, 1,260 days, 3.5 years, 42 months, 10 days. all of these things, you have to, at some point, ask the question, is this figurative or is this literal? And it's no different here in Revelation chapter 12. So when at the beginning of this study of who the male child is, I just want to make a determination from what I see in the scripture is that all four of these observations, these surface observations, speaking of the male child, are speaking figuratively. Again, just to reiterate, the male child being a male person is figurative. The male child being born is figurative. The male child ruling with a rod of iron is figurative. And the male child being caught up to God and to his throne, the part about being caught up to his throne is figurative. All four of these things are figurative language. Now, when we have that locked in, now it opens itself up a little bit. Because if we think of all those things as being literal, our mind would gravitate right towards, Jesus being the identity of the male child. But when we think of those things being figurative, it opens up now to, okay, if it's figurative, who else could this be speaking of? And this is where we begin our study. Okay, so the next thing that you must do in order to understand who the man-child is you must observe, acknowledge, and accept that all of the events of Revelation 12 are future events. And they happen in the middle of the last 7 years, or in the middle of Daniel's 70th week. These are all future events. Now, there are two things I want to talk about. What most people, or a lot of people, get confused on, and they think that they're past events. The first one is the woman gives birth to the male child, because they think that the identity of the woman is Mary, either that, or they think that it's natural Israel, and that either Mary or natural Israel produced Jesus. Okay, because they believe that the boy that's born is Jesus. So he either came from Mary or figuratively came from natural Israel. And so that's a past event. So a lot of people think that this has already happened and that this is just showing us something that already happened. Well, it isn't talking about that. It's talking about a future event. All of the events of Revelation 12 are talking about future events. So that's number one that people get hung up on. The other thing is this war in heaven. And they see Satan and his angels being cast down, and the mind gravitates towards Satan's original fall when he was, he sinned because he was lifted up in pride and he was kicked out of heaven. And they think that this is what it's referring to. And there's a particular verse that comes to mind that in the Gospels, and it's over here in Luke chapter 10, verse 18, that Jesus said, he said to the 70, and I'll talk about this in a second, the context here. He said to them, I beheld Satan as lightning fall from heaven. Now, if you just took that verse out of context, alone by itself, without any of the other verses around it, you might not know what he's talking about. Is he talking about, I beheld Satan fall from heaven as lightning way back at the beginning when he fell? Because that's what a lot of people, imagine this to be. But when you bring in the context of what was going on, Jesus had sent out the 70 disciples to go out and to heal the sick, cast out devils, and do all these things. And they did that, right? They all went out, they did those things, and they came back. They were coming back here in the story in Luke chapter 10. They were coming back. They came up to Jesus and they said, hey, Jesus, you're right. Even the devils are subject unto us through your name. And then Jesus responded to their observation saying, I beheld Satan as lightning fall from heaven. So Jesus was excited for them. And he was commenting about what they had just done, what happened through them. Okay? And so in the Greek, in this verse 18, when it says, I beheld Satan, okay, the word beheld is etheorune. It's a tough one to say. Etheorune. And it's in the imperfect active indicative. So you could say, I was beholding Satan as lightning fall from heaven. So this isn't in the past. This is something that he was just doing. He was just observing Satan fall from heaven. And that was because the 70 disciples had gone out and they were taking authority over Satan again and again and again and again, casting out devils and healing the sick and all this. And that's what Jesus was commenting on there. So, it's not what some people think it is, talking about Satan's original fall. So you can't use that verse as a reference to what's happening in Revelation 12, because they're not the same thing. So in Revelation 12, here's the scene. You have a woman who's pregnant, figurative. She's about to give birth to a child. There's a dragon that's ready, hovering over the woman, and hating the woman and hating the child, ready to devour the child as soon as it is born. So then the child is born, okay, but Satan isn't there, right? For some reason, all of a sudden, he's not there. He was there. He was waiting for the child to be born, but then he's not there. Where did he disappear to? Well, a little bit later, Michael and his angels, pick a fight and start a war in heaven. And that's not God's heaven. It's in the heavenlies, where Satan is operating his operations here over, the kingdoms of the world. Because it's time for him to be removed from that place of authority, Michael goes, and so he's distracted. Satan is distracted from devouring the child because Michael shows up. The war begins, and while the war is going on in heaven between all these angels, the child is born, and as soon as the child is born, the child is caught up to God and to his throne, and then Satan gets thrown down to the earth, and his angels get cast down with him. And as soon as Satan realizes that he's been cast down to the earth and he lost the authority that he has enjoyed all these thousands of years, he's extremely angry. He's filled with wrath, and he goes to persecute the woman. Okay, but the woman is not there because she was taken away with 2 wings of great eagle into her prepared place. So this is all of what's going on here in chapter 12. Okay, this is all these are all connected events. This is like a storyline of things that happen in sequential order or simultaneously. Okay? And then he persecutes the woman, but he can't really do anything except spew out hatred and insults and all these accusations out of his mouth. Okay, and so he can't do anything about the woman because she is in her prepared place. So he goes after the woman, the remnant or the remaining seed of the woman, who, and the Bible says they are those who hold to the testimony of Jesus. They are Christians during the last 3.5 years. And it says he goes forth to persecute them for 42 months or for 3.5 years. Okay, so this timing indicator of 3.5 years is everything that we need to know about when all of these events take place. They all take place right in the middle of the last 7 years. The woman giving birth, the war in heaven, Satan being cast down, It all happens right there in the middle of the last 7 years. And those timing indicators are key because it says right at that time when he's cast down, he has authority for only 42 more months, or 1,260 days, or 3.5 years. It's the last 3.5 years. So in order to understand who the man-child is, you have to settle in your mind and in your heart that all of these events in Revelation 12 are future events that take place right in the middle of the last 7 years. So that's number 2. Number 3, you must consider and fully embrace our relationship with Jesus and our union with him, that we are joint heirs with Christ. Because a lot of the things that it says about Jesus, it says about us as well. That we are so united, he's the head, we are the body, right? We are joint heirs with Christ, and we will rule and reign with him. To them that overcome, I will give them power to rule with a rod of iron. All these things that it says about Jesus, it also says about Christians, okay? It's because we're united with him. So without understanding our union and how the realities of that union affect us as believers, you can't understand who the man-child is, because all of these things come into play in interpreting the figure of who the man-child represents. So this is just the groundwork. I'm laying the foundation for this study. So this is part 1. When we come back, I'm going to start getting into a lot of the details, okay, of how a lot of different verses of how we pull all this together and identify the man-child once and for all. So I hope you're excited about that. We'll see you next time.